Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Last Friday, ISIS carried out an attack in Paris that left around 129 dead and has also taken responsibility for the downing of a Russian passenger jet. These two events appear to have galvanized world leaders into attempting to come up with a strategy as thousands of Syrian refugees knock on Europe's door. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. In the aftermath of the attacks, French authorities have swept across the country, and they took 8 people into custody and killed 2 more in a raid that led to the death of the ringleader of the attacks. French President François Hollande has extended the state of emergency for another 3 months and plans visits to Washington and Moscow to coordinate a response. Meanwhile, both Paris and Moscow have been carrying out a series of airstrikes against Raqqa, the self-proclaimed capital of ISIS. Here at home, Syrian refugees has taken center stage, with nearly 30 governors calling on President Obama to halt taking them in. On Capitol Hill, the House of Representatives approved a measure by an overwhelming vote of 289 to 137 to suspend the program allowing Syrian and Iraqi refugees into the country until key national security agencies certify that they do not pose a security threat. President Obama has said that the vetting process is already tough enough and vows to veto the measure. In our studio is Michael Laughlin, he's a political science professor at Salisbury University. Also on the phone with us is Mukhtar Khan. He's a professor at the University of Delaware and also with the Delaware Islamic Society. And welcome to the program, both of you. So
Thank you for having us.
First of all, I'll turn to you, Michael, just to get what is your own initial reaction to the Paris attacks, and what does it say about the state of play when it comes to security, for one thing, but also the state of play in terms of how this conflict is playing out with ISIS?
In the context of what ISIS is attempting to do in the Middle East, this is and the fact that the West, through the United States and through allied powers, are involved in a war against ISIS right now, this is part of the blowback that we would expect that will likely continue to expand, I suspect. And certainly with the French getting involved then directly with the bombing raids, this then generates, the confrontation further between ISIS and Western powers. So I think that there's a long-term prospect to this continuing. The one hope that I have is that with Secretary of State John Kerry attempting to explore the possibility of some Syrian peace talks, with negotiations with the major players, including the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrian government, at least with Assad staying in place for the time being, with long-term prospect perhaps of then exiting. But I think so that there is some possibility, even in the context of this kind of crisis in France, that a diplomatic initiative can still emerge. I mean, that's our best hope. To emerge in a more peaceful way out of this context.
Mukhtar, what was your, obviously, your own personal reaction when you heard about these attacks, and how do you see it fitting into the overall conflict with ISIS?
Well, I was both shocked and also not very surprised because in the last few weeks, ISIS has been under great pressure. Nearly everybody is bombing them. The French joined in October. The Russians have been bombing some of their targets. The Turks also occasionally bombed them, and the U.S. has continued to bomb them. And so they were under pressure to retaliate, and they had been promising to take revenge. I think that France has become a target of opportunity in the sense that while ISIS would like to strike at other countries too, but the only place where they are able to actually conduct operations appears to be France because of the large segment of the French society, which is at the moment disenchanted, marginalized, and feels, especially after the Charlie Hebdo events feels that it is being targeted by the majority community. So there are disenchanted Muslims of Arab origin in France, and a fertile ground for ISIS to recruit. So that's one thing. And a large number of French nationals have gone and trained with ISIS in Iraq and Syria and have already returned to France. So they should have hundreds of assets inside France. So France, I think, they really have to ratchet up their security system at home and also think of their foreign policy. I mean, what does France, with its token participation in the war against ISIS, it only radicalizes its own population without actually having any impact in the Middle East. The second thing is that even though President Obama has very vigorously defended his policy in the region, especially with regards to Syria, I feel that what the West is doing, including Turkey and some of the major Middle Eastern powers like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, they are indulging in tokenism. I mean, for example, France promised massive retaliation, merciless, pitiless, and all they ended up doing were to drop like 20, 30 bombs on Raqqa. These kind of attacks, which seem to have no impact on ISIS except to prevent their ability to expand further. That is the only success we have had militarily, that we have contained their expansion, but not much damage has been done to their capacity to hold on to territory and conduct operations. They're conducting operations in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Yemen, and all over the world in that region. So I think that the United States will have to think very seriously about whether they will have to accept ISIS or whether they will have to take a much more serious, consider a much more serious response, which would mean that joining with many countries and putting boots on the ground, which President Obama is very reluctant, but perhaps maybe France now might be interested, given its own security risks, to put boots on the ground in Syria and Iraq and go after ISIS. If we do not eliminate or rapidly diminish ISIS capacity to continue, because events like this not only show that it is operating, but also attract a lot of support. A lot of youth in countries like Egypt and Tunisia who are disenchanted see this as a major victory for ISIS against the mighty West. And it is going to be a great advertisement for recruitment and even gaining soft support, which means that people don't actually join ISIS but provide sympathy or even resources to ISIS. So I think that the success of ISIS in Paris is going to compound the problem of ISIS significantly for many countries, not just Western countries, but also Middle Eastern countries, especially Turkey and Saudi Arabia.
Let me turn to something here, because one of the things that's interesting is we've had this domestic development, which of course is that the House of Representatives has voted for legislation that would make it almost virtually impossible for some of the refugees to come in, certainly slow it down a great deal. And part of that is a reaction, obviously, on the political front. We've had a number of governors, including in Maryland, who said they don't want the refugees to come here. We did actually, we talked to a few people here in Salisbury about their reaction, what they thought about the refugees. And this is what some of them had to say.
Until they can properly vet them, I'm not in favor of it.
Kind of have mixed emotions about it. One part of me thinks that it's necessary to help people in their time of need, but also they do represent a true national security threat in the fact that ISIS can infiltrate refugees.
Well, with everything that's going on in France and, with ISIS saying that they're going to infiltrate and come in and mix in with them, that kind of, puts you on the edge a little bit.
Those are, of course, some of the voices that we talked to yesterday about the Syrian refugees, and even the people who were sympathetic, who said, yes, we should let them in, certainly expressed concern nonetheless that there might be something that happens. Michael Laughlin, how does this fit in with where we were, say, in 9/11, in which, again, we had a situation where there were, in that case, Saudis, but they were Muslim, and who carried out those attacks. How does that compare, do you think?
I think that the reaction, certainly of our governor and many of the Republican governors, is shameful in the light of what is happening in comparison to the 9/11 response. In the 9/11 response, President Bush was quite responsible in arguing that the Al Qaeda attack represented only a segment of the Muslim population, and the overwhelming majority of Muslims engaged in Islam itself as a peaceful religion. So he made explicit an effort to try to tamp down fear of Muslims in general. In contrast, in sad contrast, I think the Republicans particularly are pandering to the worst fears and ignoring evidence. I mean, the evidence so far is that the perpetrators of the Paris attacks were homegrown folks. They were nationals. So there's no connection between what happened in Paris and this flood of refugees fleeing the horrors of civil war in Syria.
What about the idea that we heard a moment ago about the suggestion, ISIS has made the suggestion that they're going to try to use that as an avenue, which we didn't see before, say, with al-Qaeda?
Well, there's no action can be taken without some risk. But I think President Obama's point that the vetting process is quite extensive. It takes from 18 to 24 months before people can come into this country. And so the likelihood remains low. I mean, I was doing some research last night, and you're much more likely to be hit by lightning than you are by a terrorist attack.
Muqtada, what is your assessment of this? I know, as a matter of fact, I was watching one of the videos that you had made, and you talked about the Islamic world trying to come to grips with modernism, as it were. How have you experienced a difference between, say, 9/11, the aftermath, and now? What do you make of this, and how does that fit into, as you see it, the Islamic world trying to deal with what you call modernity?
See, for example, 9/11 was a global shock. Nearly everybody in the world was shocked, in the Muslim world and Asia, Pacific, and Europe, etc. This hasn't come as a major shock, especially in the Middle East and the Muslim world. I mean, just one day before that, there was a double suicide attack in Beirut. Nearly 40 people were killed, 100 dead. The airliner in Egypt crashed a day before that. So violence perpetrated by extremist groups are sadly becoming a routine phenomena of Muslim existence and Middle East existence. And because of social media, even if you're not living in these countries, you're reading these messages on a daily basis. For Europeans, it came as a shock because the Western countries these days have kind of developed a sense that we can be at war overseas with absolutely no implications and repercussions at home, and that occasionally you see that attitude is shattered by events like this. But what is also interesting with regards to this Syrian refugee crisis is that it is not a reaction to Paris. It is just an indication of how xenophobic and Islamophobic the Republican Party has become. I mean, people like Ben Carson were making Islamophobic comments long before the event in Paris happened. Part of it is the feeling that the more literally bigoted comments they make about Muslims, the more profitable it is. Ben Carson made $1 million within 24 hours after he said that Muslims should not be president of this country. But they're also using Islamophobia as a weapon against Obama. So these comments by the U.S. is planning to take 10,000 in the next maybe 2 years, Syrian refugees. The Canadians, whose population is nearly 1/10 of ours, are taking 30,000. And the French have announced after the attacks in Paris that they will fulfill their commitment of taking 30,000 Syrian refugees. So it is quite strange that even France and Canada and most European countries are not as paranoid about this as the Republican Party is. And as far as this vetting process that they are talking about, it is essentially a way to completely end. I mean, which FBI agent is going to go to Raqqa to investigate whether this young man of 16 years old is a security threat or not. Most of the refugees are women and children, especially those that the United States is thinking of advancing refugee status to. So I think that this is part of the presidential election cycle. In 2012, it was the Ground Zero Mosque that was used by Republicans to ratchet up discrimination and prejudice against Muslims to get votes. This time around, I think it will now be the attacks in Paris. And like we forgot the Ground Zero Mosque after the election, and I think then after the next presidential cycle, I think this whole radical Islam terrorism threat will also disseminate. And perhaps your readers don't know that in the last 15 years, since 9/11, 14 years, we have had only 50 deaths in the United States from what people call so-called Islamic terrorism, whereas our gun deaths are 280,000 in the same period. So it is ridiculous to think of Muslims as a major national security threat. The only problem is that such hatred and such a language is going to actually create a disaster in this country by discriminating against a vulnerable minority.
Let me ask you, by the way, Muqtada, have you seen personally a blowback? Have people treated you any differently? And what about this idea about Islam trying to come to grips with the modern world?
Yes. In the last 2-3 years, I have seen significant changes. I have seen that in attitudes of certain students who come with very heavy baggage. That means that they are listening either to their pastors or listening to AM radio. So they're coming with some very, very strong prejudices, which is compounded with a lot of ignorance about the history of the region, the current history of the region. We are, like, for example, on the 10th of December this month, we are having a major conference with the security police and there are 16 or 17 agencies in Delaware, security related, about security for mosques, etc. Then the incidences of literally violence against Muslims has increased significantly. The FBI says that only 14% of all hate crimes, religion-based hate crimes, are against Muslims, and 60% are against Jews. That means America is way more anti-Semitic than it is Islamophobic. But Muslims are about 0.5% of the population, and they are bearing a burden of nearly 14% of the hate crime. So the frequency is very high. But simultaneously, there are also Americans who are standing up for Muslims. And we saw that last month when there was a nationwide protest against mosques. I mean, these rhetoric that Muslims are imposing the Sharia on America, which is so deeply, profoundly ridiculous that it makes me wonder how hateful people have to be to accept facts which are so obviously ridiculous. So, yes, there are people who are standing up. Bernie Sanders, for example, has stood up in his campaign and said Islamophobia is not good for us and we need to work against it. There are many churches and many synagogues who stand up with Muslims when episodes of Islamophobia occur. But the point is that there is clearly a significant constituency in the United States which is very hostile now to Islam and Muslims, and that will constantly reflected in mainstream rhetoric. And it is the mainstreaming of hateful comments which leads to backlash, and backlash is of many types. Backlash is an economic transactions. People are reluctant to do business with Muslims, reluctant to hire Muslims when they are downsizing their units or companies. Muslims suddenly find that they are the first to lose the jobs. I have a cousin who was pretty high up in a very tech company, was surprised that he was let go, and whether it's a fact or not, but a lot of Muslims feel that Islamophobia is literally creeping into other areas beyond just political rhetoric.
Mukhtar,
Children, even in Delaware, half the Muslim kids said they have been bullied in public schools. So, there is a backlash.
We've been speaking with Mukhtar Khan. He's a professor at University of Delaware, also with the Delaware Islamic Society, and also Michael Laughlin. He's a political science professor at Salisbury University on the events, of course, that have unfolded there in Paris. Next up after the break, we'll be taking a look at the events coming out of the University of Missouri with racial tensions on American campuses being front and center. That'll be coming up again. You're listening to Delmarva Today.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.